everyone, and welcome back to another video on the channel. Today, I'll be doing something slightly different to the usual content I do. Today, I'll be doing a full analysis and review on one of my all-time favorite Minecraft series, known as Third Life. Now, let me give you guys some quick background information on this series. It was originally started as an experimental gameplay series featuring a variety of well-known content creators of the gaming community. But after just a few episodes, this series became one of the most sensational SMP experiences I had witnessed in a long time, and I've seen a lot of good ones. Third Life had it all. It had a driving plot, genius humor, phenomenal voice acting, and incredible role-playing. But most of all, this series had Grian. Genuinely, he and other ambitious content creators were the main reason this series turned out so impressive, and I certainly hope it's a series that will be remembered for a long time. With that said, it certainly has a few flaws scattered throughout the story, but then again, I can't think of any sort of Minecraft series that doesn't, and none of those flaws ever really detract from the series' quality as a whole. With that said, since we have the sequel Third Life series called Last Life rising up from the hype that surrounded its predecessor, I figured, what better time to do a full analysis of this series than now? So without further ado, let's hop into this series review. Hey, what do you know, that rhymes. By the way guys, if you enjoyed this video and you enjoy the content you see on this channel, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so you never miss a video. Disclaimer, major series spoilers are ahead, so make sure to click off this video if you hadn't watched how the series ended. Anyway, enjoy the video! Now, we're going to start this analysis off by giving all of you a brief explanation on the rules of the Third Life SMP, in case some of you aren't familiar. And if you aren't familiar with Third Life at this point, shame on you. But anyway, the rules. So each player starts their gameplay by spawning in a random location in a world with a very small world border. The gamer tag above their in-game character is colored green, and their goal is to play regular survival. So basically, gather resources, build a base, make friends, the works. But if a player dies, their gamer tag turns yellow. When this occurs, the need to exercise caution comes into play, because if that player dies again, they will be on their third life. Their gamer tag will turn red, and their new goal is to take out the other players' lives. They can do this by setting traps, engaging in combat, stealing their resources, or whatever crazy imaginative way to carry out that goal. When a player dies on their third life, they enter into spectator mode and the series is over for them. The last person alive wins the series, and those are the only rules regarding Third Life. There's no rules against basic offenses such as stealing or griefing. Now you're probably thinking at this point, wow, with rules like that, surely this series is bound to quickly devolve into chaos. And to that I say, you're correct. Next, I'm going to go over all the different characters and factions that were involved in this series storyline. But before I get into the little details regarding each faction, let me just quickly run through the list. So we have the villager people, the castle people, the hobbits, the kingdom of Dogworts, and the sand people, along with a few isolated characters consisting of Joel, aka Smallish Beans, Big B, and Skizzleman. Okay, so first of all, I'm gonna discuss the isolated characters. I'll start with Skizzle. So truth be told, despite the fact that this is my first time watching his videos whatsoever, I actually really liked Skizzle's perspective in this series. He has the kind of voice that comes off as having a malicious and maniacal tone to it, and that type of voice talent really went hand in hand with Skizzle's character as a loyal defender of Rendog's enchanting business, and even later on in becoming a ferocious fighter in the Red Winter Army. And even though we can all probably agree that Skizz's decision to storm into the castle base alone with only one life left, just to abruptly end his series, was reckless, I feel like it was the kind of decision that perfectly fit into the character I see him as throughout the series, and that's as an extremely loyal follower of the Dogworts kingdom since day one, whose fierce nature often clouded his better judgment, and due to that major flaw in his judgment, it led him to disregard the Red King's wishes to stay together as a team, and it led to his own demise in the end. In summary, I thought Skizzle's perspective was a really fun time all around, and I can't wait to see what he has in store for Last Life. Okay, let's talk about Joel now. And as for Joel, his perspective was only alright. For the most part, I enjoyed Joel's character arc as a naive little hermit, who was simply trying to figure out the best way to navigate around the dangerous world he lived in. Or something like that. If I'm being completely honest, I had a hard time piecing together all of Joel's shining moments into a specific character who could coincide with the rest of the storylines happening in this series. For example, I certainly thought his house was pretty, but I feel like the architectural style was the kind of thing that belonged to one of his survival Let's Plays rather than a competitive hardcore series with a subverting twist. Also, later on in the series, he decided to create a monopoly on dead bushes, which was not only kinda dumb, but it wasn't a monopoly that could entice the other players and stir up chaos, which was the case for some of the other monopolies on the server. And then, when the time came where he got to his red life, his first inclination was to burn random flammable structures with no rhyme or reason. And it was at that point where I really struggled to figure out where Joel stood in the series regarding his new goal to eliminate the other players' lives. Although, one thing I did appreciate about Joel's character is how he had a hard time choosing to ally himself with either the Sand People or the Kingdom of Dogworts, until near the end of the series when he settled on joining the Sand People in their Red Desert Army. It wasn't nearly as interesting as Impulse's idea to constantly betray and ally with different factions depending on how each one benefited himself. More on that later. But overall, Joel has served his own unique purpose in the Third Life storyline, which gave the series its well-deserved admiration. I especially loved the final battle, where he showed up to the Red Desert with his army of wolfies by his side, and that was a lot of fun to see. Maybe that's where my wolf Doggo disappeared to when I was busy writing this. Alright, we've talked about Skizzle, we've talked about Joel. The final isolated character to discuss is Big B, a real Minecraft veteran. And can I just personally say, as a non-veteran Minecrafter, how gratifying it is to see someone like Big B return to the playing field after such a long time away? With all of that said, I gotta say I felt like his series perspective was kinda boring, to say the least. He basically spent a good number of his episodes just mining underground, and he barely had any interactions with any of the other members online in his first episode, aside from Martin, that is. Also, I feel like Big B's commentary skills were a little lackluster in the first few episodes, and it was these aspects that made for a pretty uneventful start. That said, I gotta say my personal favorite moments in his videos were all the times he interacted with multiple other players in the series. I thought it was interesting how he spent all of his first few episodes just exploring everything there was to see within the small world that was Third Life, and being part of some really fun exchanges that we don't get to see in other Third Lifers' perspectives, usually because they are so occupied with building up their own territory or faction. And when Big B finally did settle, he chose to build his base on a mountain that overlooked the faction whom he currently had the strongest alliance with, the Kingdom of Dogworts. Although one detail I've noticed throughout Big B's perspective in Third Life is that he was using a texture pack consisting of all the game's old textures, and personally, I wasn't a huge fan. Now, I'm not trying to throw shade at Big B for that decision. It was his gameplay, therefore type of texture pack was his decision. However, I personally feel like his use of the old Minecraft textures somewhat muddled the concept of Third Life, a series where players could rediscover the enjoyment of the simple vanilla gameplay experience in the most recently updated version of Minecraft. But hey, that's just my opinion. Another major flaw in Big B's videos is how he played the Third Life introductory video at the beginning of every one of his episodes. Like, come on! A lot of his viewers already know what Third Life is all about. All he had to do was roll the clip at the beginning of just the first episode and everything would have been fine. Overall though, I could see why other people would find Big B's storyline more enjoyable than maybe even some of the main faction storylines. It wasn't my particular favorite thing, but I certainly look forward to his upcoming shenanigans for the series' last life. And hey, the guy came in 4th place at the end of his series. Not too shabby. Okay, we're done discussing the isolated characters. Let's get into factions. We'll start by talking about the Village People. Now, the Village People faction was composed of 3 individuals, those being Tango, Etho, and Impulse. This group came together in the first episode when Grian told Etho how he secretly hoarded some villagers for later use in the series. Then Etho blabbed the news to a few other members of the server on what Grian said to him about the villagers. So these members arranged a hard negotiation where they eventually pushed Green into releasing the villagers in exchange for a chest filled with a few goodies from each of them. It was a persistent tactic, and I certainly give the village people props for it. Eventually, Green reluctantly took the deal, but not without expressing his regret and telling Etho his secret. Later on, Impulse, Tango, and Etho banded together, took the villagers, and built themselves a villager training outpost underground. However, soon after the project was complete, the group eventually parted ways and each member went their own direction, allowing this faction to take the silver medal as the second shortest-lived faction in the series. The gold medal goes to a short-lived alliance between Martin, Bigby, and Grian, known as the Blue Sword Boys, in case you were curious. After an unexpected twist of events, Green was forced to devote his loyalty as Scar's teammate instead. Now I'll just explain what happened to each of the village people when their faction ended. Etho made an alliance with the Kingdom of Dogworts and got up to some pretty clever shenanigans with their faction. Tango went on to create his dangerously fun lava redstone minigame, which a couple players lost their first life to. He also went ahead in trying, and ultimately failing, to create his own monopoly on the server's cows. And while that monopoly didn't work out so well, it certainly was effective in causing chaos to erupt on the server. Later on, Tango fought alongside the Sand People in the Red Desert Army until his eventual demise. Finally, Impulse went around creating a bunch of artificial alliances with random factions and later betraying them at his own benefit. And as much as this was a genius strategy, many other players were able to catch on to the dangerous game Impulse was playing, and it eventually led to the remaining players alive on the server to turn against him, causing him to lose his final life. The next faction we will be discussing is the Crassel People, made up of B000100 and Zombie Cleo, and this is how their story began. Due to a bug on the server, B-dubs ended up spawning right next to Zombie Cleo, and after a heated discussion on how they were both acting kinda intimidating toward each other, they finally decided to just team up and build a castle-like base surrounded by a moat of water, and they named it the Crassel. To be completely honest, their little castle was one of the more impressive structures on the Third Life SMP. But no matter how many times I've rewatched their perspectives of the first couple of Third Life episodes, I cannot, for the life of me, figure out the point behind misspelling their faction's name as Crassel, and that was really the only major flaw that I noticed regarding how the faction was first put together. In terms of gaining power on the server though, I feel like they somewhat held back in a way, because they never tried to claim a monopoly on any sort of valuable resource, nor did they often travel to different factions to try and get an alliance with other members. However, I do feel like another one of their best lines of defense came through, not with any physical structure built by this faction, but rather through their personalities. Beat-Up's character was often known for having a fiery disposition and a short temper, especially when other players got away with pulling a fast one on him. Plus, B-Dubs was a very maniacal character, as he liked to look for the pettiest excuses to eliminate other players' lives before he became a Red Life himself. For instance, when he found out another player was caught wearing a helmet on the server, even though everyone on the server agreed not to do so, he gathered a group of players to shoot that player to death with flaming arrows. But after that happened, he went ahead and did the same thing to another player for seeing that player wear a helmet and not telling anyone about the injustice that occurred that day. As for Cleo, she was known for having a more mischievous personality, and she certainly took every opportunity to cause bouts of trouble for other players on the Third Life server, although sometimes that trouble managed to come back to them in unexpected ways. Sometime after forging an alliance with the Kingdom of Dogworts, Cleo was in a feisty mood, and she took out her own energy by setting Joel's house on fire, and it caused poor Joel to lose his second life. Unbeknownst to Cleo and B-Dubs at the time, Joel was also under the protection of the Kingdom of Dogworts. Because of Cleo's act of mischief, the Kingdom of Dogworts ended up breaking their alliance with the Crassel People. After that breakaway, Cleo ended up forming a tenuous alliance with the Sand People, but tensions between B-Dubs and the Sand People were so thick after they set a lava trap in the Crassel base, causing B-Dubs to reach his red life. So, B-Dubs still harbored some resentment towards the Sand People afterward. Although I honestly have to say, this was actually a great instance of the storyline, where the members were able to perfectly reflect feelings of hatred and dispute towards certain members when they're in character, despite the fact that all the Third Life members are actually very good friends in reality. so this was a fine example of the heart that each of the Third Life members poured into their characters, and it's really that element of the series that makes it such a masterpiece for gamers like me today. Oh, and don't worry about B-Dubs. He had the opportunity to blow off some steam during the Battle of the Red Desert, but unfortunately it wasn't enough for him to retain his loyalty to the Sand People forever, because as soon as the rest of the battles against Dogworts were over, he left the Sand People behind in the dust, and retreated to the safety of his castle all alone. I say alone because Cleo has already been eliminated from the series. Anyway, I think we'll pause here on the Castle People's story. Next, we will discuss a duo of individuals who refer to themselves as the Hobbits, those being Scott, aka S Major, aka dang that's a long name, wow that's a lot of names, and also Jimmy, aka Solidarity Gaming. Their story started when they ran into each other while mining in the same cave, and they agreed to team up as they were most familiar with each other than any of the other players, as they were part of several previous series together. After exploring the land for some time, they came across a pleasant meadow, where they decided to settle and create their base for the series. So that's what they did, and they named their little faction the Hobbits, for the way they created their homes by carving each of them out in the side of a hill. In my personal opinion, the Hobbits certainly weren't the fiercest faction of the server, but their base was definitely the prettiest one. I think I'll have to thank the flowers for that bit. Midway into the series, Scott and Jimmy ended up creating a monopoly on the server's supply of netherwort. I must admit that that was a very smart move on their part, as netherwort was one of the resources that would be harder to obtain since it was only found in the nether. Plus, netherwort was able to be used to create a variety of practical potions if war ever broke out on the server, so business was certainly going well for the Hobbits. However, one of the more major flaws with this faction is made clear with who is in the alliance, because those who watch his channel, including me, all know how much of a giant noob Jimmy can be at Minecraft, and even Scott sometimes criticized him for this. This is made clear to us when Jimmy died twice in the same episode, in some of the most comical ways. So when Jimmy ended up on his third life, it became pretty clear that Jimmy wasn't exactly going to be the fiercest killer on the server. But sometimes that was a good thing for the Hobbits, because oftentimes they were able to put up an innocent and newbie front and use it to their advantage in some situations. For instance, after the Hobbits blackmailed Tango into giving them a cow out of his monopoly, they hid said cow somewhere beneath their base, and convinced other players that the cow died while it was being escorted to their base. After all, Jimmy was the one who brought it back home. Unfortunately, that newbie front wouldn't last for long, as more red lives on the server, Jimmy included, were setting out to accomplish their new goal: eliminate the other players' lives. And that danger was made clear to the Hobbits when the Red King and his hand marched directly into their base and demanded that the Hobbits swear an allegiance to them. In exchange, they would offer protection toward the Hobbits faction. However, Scott didn't exactly approve of the idea to look toward the Red King as his superior. As for Jimmy, he wanted to use this opportunity to prove to the Red King that he could be just as fierce and revolting as any other person on the Red Life. So he decided to make the bold, but not necessarily smart, move to burn the banner that would have resembled the proposed allegiance, right in front of the Red King's eyes. Due to Jimmy's actions, the Red King immediately put the Hobbits in his list of targeted players for elimination. Now that the Hobbits were targets of the Red Kingdom, they decided instead to try and form some sort of alliance with the Sand People, who were currently at the top of the Red King's target list. So they went to go consult the Sand People on their proposal, and I guess you could say that the discussion went better than expected.
Scott, what do you think?
I think we have all become great friends today.
Eventually, the day for the Battle of the Red Desert finally arrived, and the Hobbits were right there alongside the Sand People, awaiting their foes who would soon arrive for battle. The battle was intense, to say the least. Unfortunately, that day was one where the Sand People Alliance were forced to take an L. They were unable to eliminate any members of the Red Winter Army, and perhaps even more unfortunately, Jimmy ended up being the first player eliminated from the series that day. Alright, I think I'll come back to what happens with Scott later. Now it's time to discuss the two factions that I think were probably the most influential throughout this series, those being the Kingdom of Dogworts and the Sand People. In my personal opinion, each of these factions followed their own story that was different from the others we've discussed so far. The main reason for this is because, despite the fact that all the other factions' beginnings had their own unique approach, they all seem to follow the same idea where one player is like, hey, let's team up this series, and the other player is just like, cool. This wasn't the case for the Sand People or the Kingdom of Dogworts. They had a much more complex story and I can't wait to get into it. Let's start with the Kingdom of Dogworts. The Kingdom of Dogworts was a faction that was mainly made up of Rendog and Martin, aka in the Littlewood. Plus there were a few other members with an alliance so strong they were practically considered part of the faction. I had a blast reviewing this faction's story. It had brilliant strategies, perfectly integrated references to popular franchises, excellent editing, incredible role-playing, and a tragical story about friendship and loyalty. In the beginning, however, the Kingdom of Dogworts wasn't even a kingdom. It was barely even a faction. It started when Martin, a nomadic survivalist, crossed paths with Rendog, a bright young man with a vision. Rendog was the first player to obtain one of the most valuable items on the server, an enchanting table. He ended up using that enchanting table to start his own humble business known as Renchanting. Tagline: don't be a dog, be a god. Martin ended up making a great business deal with Rendog. In exchange for free enchantments for his tools and armor, Martin had to promote the brand new business to everyone throughout the server. The business ended up taking off really well, and many players were looking for an alliance with Rendog. This helped Rendog to not only gain more power over the server, but also strengthened his loyalty to his business partner, Martin. As for Martin, he too was able to get his hands on the first of another valuable item, that being an ender chest. And despite the fact that Martin chose to keep his ender chest location a secret for the first few episodes of Third Life, that didn't stop Rendog from strengthening ties with his beloved business partner. Things were turning out so successfully for Rendog that he eventually turned his little business into the Kingdom of Dogworts, and he proclaimed himself as the king. And soon after, he appointed Martin as his hand, and thus, the Kingdom of Dogworts was born. Everything seemed to be going well until one day, Good Times with Scar arrived at the kingdom's entrance. That day, Scar was already on his second life, and no doubt, many other players, including Ren and Martin, were concerned over when he may arrive at his red life. Anyway, Scar had a proposal that would allow the Kingdom of Dogworts to create an alliance with the Sand People. However, Scar demanded that Rendog relinquished his enchanting table in exchange for this alliance. This very notion terrified Rendog, as his beloved enchanting table was not only a large part of their business brand, but it was essentially the heart and soul of the faction itself. Without it, this faction would be nothing. Rendog heavily protested against Scar's offer, but this came with consequences. Scar swore to Rendog and Martin that as soon as he reached his red light, the Kingdom of Dogworts would be his very first target for elimination. Rendog and Martin took this threat very seriously, but they weren't extremely concerned as they knew this wouldn't be a legitimate issue until Scar reached his red life. Little did they know, that day was sooner than they imagined. When it came to his threat of retaliation, Scar was a man of his word, but this retaliation came in the least expected way. On his first day as a red life, Scar and Grian arrived at the Kingdom of Dogworts once again. Scar claimed he wanted to apologize for his maniacal behavior from the last episode, and tried to start up a friendly conversation with Ren and Martin. After Ren and Martin refused to buy his apology, Scar eventually gave up and left. Sometime later, Martin and Rendog discovered a rigged Tnt Trap with a spare enchanting table as bait. Even though the trap was not set up correctly, I wonder why that was the case, Martin was desperately trying to disarm the trap to prevent it from going off randomly. Unfortunately for Martin and Rendog, Jimmy, who was visiting the Kingdom of Dogworts that day, started tampering with the trap to try and get rid of the TNT and...
Oh! What?
Yeah, that happened. As you can all see, Scar kept his word about his threat to the Kingdom of Dogworts, and while Martin saw what has transpired as an absolute blow to the faction, Rendog saw an opportunity to present himself and Martin with the ultimate test. It was the next episode after the attack from the Sand People transpired. Everyone was online the server, and Rendog had an idea to send a message to the entire server. He asked Martin to accompany him to a strange podium outside the house with the enchanting table. He gave Martin a custom-named diamond axe and demanded he use it to take away his second life. After a moment of hesitation, Martin gave Ren what he wanted, and took away Rendog's second life for the entire server to witness.
On with it, me laddie! Red winter is coming, me laddie!
What have I done?
It was one of the hardest tasks Martin ever completed, but the test was not over yet. According to the rules of Third Life, any player can attack a player on the red life if that player initiated PvP on them first, by hitting them. And that's exactly what Rendog's next move was. He punched Martin with his fist and gave him the opportunity to slay him right then and there and end his series. It would have been easy. Ren had no weapon or armor. Martin had the choice to slay him right where he stood and claim the kingdom of Dogworts for himself. It was at this point that the purpose of this test became crystal clear. To prove to the entire server that the foundation for the kingdom of Dogworts wasn't just about gaining control of the server, it was about the great affection and care the members of this faction had for each other. It was the ultimate test of the loyalty and friendship Martin had for his king. With that, Martin put down his axe and withdrew from the podium. From this point forward, Martin and Rendog had sworn only to fight for each other and never against each other. Eventually, they decided to declare war upon the Sand People and begin their very own Red Winter Army. What followed was a series of battles between the Red Winter Army and the Sand People's Red Desert Army. After a long period of war against the Sand People, however, the kingdom of Dogworts was woefully unable to stand their ground for long, and both Martin and Rendog eventually had their remaining lives taken by the menacing Red Desert Army, thus concluding the story of the kingdom of Dogworts. Tragic as it was certainly an absolutely phenomenal experience checking out Ren and Martin's perspective for this one. However, the one faction whose storyline truly takes the cake from me is the last faction we have to discuss this video. The final faction I will talk about is my all-time favorite faction of the series, the Sand People, comprised of Grian and Good Times with Scar, a true tale of tribulation, terror, and companionship. This faction gained its power on the server, not through loyalty and assurance, like the Kingdom of Dogworts did, but rather through intimidation and deception. This faction originated back in episode 1 of Third Life. Grian bumped into Scar while he was exploring the world's village. Scar was busy committing arson on every single house in the village, which I felt like, in a good way, was strangely out of character compared to the Scar I'm used to watching. But even if Scar didn't waste his time burning down the village in his first episode, I don't think his storyline would have turned out any differently this series. Anyway, Scar took Grian aside in order to talk to him about a proposition, one that Grian interpreted as a fairly tall order. Scar offered to team up with Grian, and together they would claim the entire desert biome as their own monopoly and sell overpriced sand to the other Third Lifers. The overpriced thing was just an assumption given that this is Scar we're talking about. But Grian ended up declining the offer because he felt like it was a task that was far too heavy for any one, or even two players to accomplish alone. However, thanks to a shocking turn of events, Grian's position on the matter would have to change. All of you guys who are watching who are as big of a fan of Grian as I am will know about Grian's mischievous reputation, especially on the Hermitcraft server, to pull off small-scale pranks, only for them to amplify into some crazy situations. Who knew that planting a few mushroom blocks down in a place where people shop would result in a full-blown civil war? Of course, The Third Life series was by no means related to Hermitcraft, but Grian still had a tendency to cause small-scale trouble and chaos wherever he found an opportunity to do so. And that's exactly what he did sometime after declining Scar's offer. Back at the village, Martin gathered together some of the other players to advertise the brand new Ren Chanting business. Tagline, "Don't be a dog, be a god." And while the rest of the group was busy, Grian noticed a creeper wandering around nearby and tried to lure it into the group of players just to playfully freak everyone out. However, all pranks always have a chance of going wrong.
Oh my god! I didn't think he would actually die!
And that's exactly what happened in Grian's case. So after that happened, Grian apologized to Scar and offered to be his teammate until he lost his own first life to make up for the incident. After all the shocking events, Grian and Scar's character development was finally set in motion. Now that Grian was forced to be in service to Scar for the rest of his first life, he now had to help Scar take over the entire desert biome like Scar had originally proposed. This allowed the two of them to have the largest land claim in the entire server. But before they even did that, Scar had another bright idea to chop down all the dark oak trees on the server and steal the saplings as another substantial monopoly. But even after those two prosperous claims gave the Sand People significant control on the server, their plot only thickened from there. For those of you who watch Scar's channel, you'll know that he has a reputation of dying very easily in Minecraft. And even though it wasn't entirely his fault that it happened, Scar ended up being the first player on Third Life to lose one of his 3 lives on episode 1. This caused a lot of players to view Scar as possibly the most dangerous player on Third Life, and some of them would often take extra measures in order to ensure that they were on good terms with the Sand People. Because of this, Scar often liked to ask other players to give him some of their valuable weapons, armor, or resources in exchange for a potential future alliance with the Sand People, or an improved reputation, or some rare resources such as the missing dark oak saplings if they found them, or some points to level up. Forget it with the positive spin. Basically, Scar would just go around swindling other players out of their best possessions in exchange for a fake friendship pass that Scar was bound to turn his back on later. We already witnessed an example of such swindling when Scar offered the Kingdom of Dogworts protection in exchange for their enchanting table. And of course, Grian, being the intellectual he was, caught on fairly quickly to the fact that all of these exchanges were absolute scams, and they were bound to backfire on the both of them later. And in time, backfire they did. For beginners, after zombie Cleo learned she would be getting some pathetic reputation points, instead of the dark oak saplings she was promised in exchange for her enchanted chestplate, she snuck into the desert biome and kidnapped Scar's beloved pet llama named Pizza. And Scar had to give up many of his best weapons and armor to Cleo in order to finally get him back. But even before Scar was reunited with his precious Pizza, Martin, Scott, Joel, and Jimmy banded together and took saplings from another dark oak forest located near the Hobbits faction, one which Scar and Grian had no knowledge of. And they basically ended up obliterating Scar's dark oak wood monopoly by growing a tree at his faction right in front of his eyes. And, yeah. Scar was not in a good mood after this occurrence.
I will murder them.
Eventually, the next episode rolled around, and significant progress was made to the Sand People's faction. Grian set up a creeper farm right next to him and Scar's little sand fortress in the middle of the desert, which allowed them to have a somewhat unlimited supply of gunpowder to use for TNT. After all, it was clear that the Sand People found great pleasure in explosive destruction throughout the series. Scar was also able to get in contact with zombie Cleo regarding the terms for Pizza's release from where she hid him. Of course, this information didn't come without a price, and Scar was forced to relinquish some of his best gear in exchange. Thankfully, recovering Pizza from the Crassel People wasn't a major blow to the control the Sand People have retained on the server thus far. Quite the opposite. The Sand People's true power was only beginning to blossom. And soon, the Sand People will have proven the sort of chaos they are truly capable of. Towards the end of their time on the server that day, Scar was prancing across the desert plains whilst engaging in some friendly banter with his right-hand man, Grian. But in an unexpected twist of events, the duo ran right up toward the edge of a gaping ravine and... Scar had finally taken his place as the first red life on the server, and everyone online was shook with terror as Scar's death message was broadcasted across the server. Those who fought their hardest to be on good terms with the Sand People up to this point could only watch and hope that their efforts would be enough, even though they knew that Scar could turn their back on them at any moment. Okay guys, now that I've made it to a point where the Sand People's story takes an extraordinary turn, I'm going to take the time to discuss the way I view Grian and Scar's characters. After all, I've yet to explain why the Sand People have my favorite storyline, aside from the fact that Grian is basically my all-time favorite Minecraft YouTuber of the entire platform. Anyway, I'll start with Scar's character. Now, many players came to regard Scar as the main villain of the Third Life series, and to be honest, not only do I understand this notion, but I also kinda agree. However, just because Scar was considered a villain didn't mean he was truly a bad guy. If anything, Scar's character to me felt more like an innocent young man who only played the role of a villain because that was what other people expected him to do out of their fear of him. We see this made clear throughout his perspective in this series, because when the time came for the Sand People to go into offensive mode against the rest of the factions, Scar merely acted as a diversion, while Grian was actually the one to plan and set up each of the traps, and we all know how that goes. For instance, when he distracted Rendog and Martin when they were his first target, all he did as a diversion was try to engage in a friendly conversation. He even admitted to having a plan to try and steal Bigby's giant cookie from his house on the nearby hilltop, which, to be honest, was actually among the first of Scar's ridiculous plans as a Red Life, so it was that moment that truly demonstrated the fun-loving, childish side of Scar's character in the series. Nevertheless, each time Scar interacted with other players, even when there was no trap planned, he always put up the same friendly attitude with those he met. An example of this behavior was after zombie Cleo burned down Joel's house. Scar came up to him and offered to fix his roof if he promised to discontinue his support for the Kingdom of Dogworts, and he even followed through with his end of the bargain, despite usually being known for trade offers of pathetic friendship papers that he usually turned his back on as he pleased. Small examples prove that Scar had a soft heart, despite having such a rough exterior. But the ultimate example that proves Scar's true colors was by the way he viewed his teammate Grian. Throughout the first few episodes of this series, Grian often grew fearful of Scar, and he often viewed him as a madman for the way he manipulated other players into giving him more power on the server. But even more so, Grian was afraid of the dangerous situation he would be in by the time he lost his first life on the server, as he insisted to Scar that he would no longer be by his side when that time arrived. However, Scar often tried to coerce Grian into reconsidering his position on the matter. Owing to the fact that at this point in the series, the two of them have been able to put so much progress in building their own little empire in the sand, Scar has come to regard Grian as more than just a servant for doing his bidding, but rather as a friend, a brother even. Regardless, Grian denied the very notion of staying on the same team as the maniac he viewed Scar as, but even though he never overtly admitted so, he knew the bond he developed with Scar had gone stronger along their journey together, and I must say, it certainly seemed like he was taking pleasure in helping Scar eliminate the other players' lives, even in spite of his own terrible trap building skills. In fact, let's discuss some of those best moments with some of those traps. Probably the most infamous of their traps was the loaded TNT trap set for the Kingdom of Dogworts. The way the trap worked was that a giant load of minecart TNTs were set to explode if the observer placed above all the TNT got triggered. A spare enchanting table Brian had would be placed above the observer block in order to tempt a passerby to take it and activate the redstone mechanism to blow up all the TNT. After Scar managed to distract Rendog and Martin long enough, Brian was able to finish setting up the trap. With that, Brian and Scar departed from the kingdom of Dogworts, and now all they had to do was wait. Some time had passed, and eventually, Martin and Rendog found the enchanting table right outside their faction's doorstep. After a few minutes of wondering who could have left this object of great value right outside their gate, Martin decided it was safe to mine the enchanting table and... yeah. Thanks to Grian's cruddy redstone skills, the trap failed. After witnessing their major fail, Grian and Scar decided to camp out at Big B's house and just watch Martin and others try to disarm the minecart TNTs. And Scar being Scar decided to use this opportunity to steal Big B's cookie. That way this failed venture wouldn't be a total loss for the Sand People. But right when Grian and Scar were ready to give up, the last thing they expected, under the circumstances, had occurred right before their eyes.
Just watched you steal it! Oh my god! No!
No way!
No!
Someone, in this case, Jimmy, tried to tamper with the TNT and caused the whole thing to blow up, eliminating 3 lives in the process, those being himself, Rendog, and Skizzleman. Despite not doing the redstone mechanics correctly, Grian and Scar managed to eliminate 3 players' lives, and from that shocking turn of events, broadcasted what was probably the most terrifying death message of the whole series. Nah, I'm only kidding. But the TNT trap certainly came in clutch as a close second. After that day full of surprises for the Sand People, Grian and Scar decided to go to the Nether and mine for netherite, as well as gather some resources to make a trap for their next target, the Crassel People. Thankfully for Grian, the plan for this trap involved no redstone this time. The first phase of this plan was for Scar to approach the Crassel base from the front and pose to B-Dubs and Cleo as this charismatic salesperson, offering to sell them a pair of luxury coffins. Meanwhile, Grian would sneak into the Crassel base and build a simple bubble elevator using soul sand from the Nether. His goal was to try and be secretive with this operation, but just in case he got rumbled by B-Dubs or Cleo during the plan's execution, Grian would just say he was trying to do them a favor by building them both a faster way to access the second floor of their base. And for the most part, Phase 1 of the plan worked. Even though B-Dubs caught Grian building the elevator trap, he actually trusted the notion that Grian and Scar were just trying to do a goodwill gesture to the Crassel People. With that, the Sand People wished B-Dubs and Cleo well, and departed from their faction. Although soon, Grian had to come back and execute Phase 2 of the plan. Scar would convince Etho to act as a diversion to lure the Crassel People out of their base. While this was happening, Grian would sneak back up to the top floor and enclose the top of his bubble elevator with obsidian and place a bucket of lava within. Then he would sneak out of the Crassel base through the back and run back around to the front of the Crassel People's faction to make it seem like he was just catching up with Scar. After a few minutes of waiting, the plan worked! B-Dubs used the bubble elevator to go up his base, and he flew right into Grian's lava trap. Also, B-Dubs was on his second life when all of this transpired, so this meant that the server now had a new red life online to cause even more chaos. After their experience at the Crassel People's faction, Scar and Grian had a good feeling about their chance to win the series. But then, they remembered Rendog's most recent death message in the chat. As soon as they realized this horrifying revelation, they knew that Rendog would use this opportunity to get revenge on them for killing him with the TNT trap earlier. And that's exactly what happened not too long after Rendog reached his red life. He and a few players he formed alliances with banded together and began to bombard the Sand People with arrows. Even though Grian and Scar were able to evade getting killed, Rendog and his troops were able to eliminate the life of Scar's beloved pet, the llama, whom he named Pizza. As heart-wrenching as it was for Scar to say goodbye to his precious Pizza in this way, he knew that this act of cruelty and sorrow would only be the beginning of what Rendog had in mind for the Sand People. So it was time to take a break from trying to eliminate the other players' lives and start working on upgrading their defenses. It was time to prepare for war. Scar knew that the Kingdom of Dogworts was a very powerful faction, with many alliances on its side, and without a doubt, those with an alliance would be happy to help Rendog and Martin eliminate the people who tried to harm their king. So the Sand People's best chance at survival against the Red Winter Army would be to recruit as many other players and factions by the Sand People's side as possible. So that's exactly what Scar set out to do. And fortunately, Scar was very successful at recruiting many players to join the Sand People's upcoming Red Desert Army to face off against Rendog and his Red Winter Army. Some of these recruits included the Hobbits, their Crassel people, Smallish Beans, and Tango. Meanwhile, Grian set out to start creating a brand new base in preparation for the upcoming Battle of Red Desert. This base wasn't as pretty as the old one, but it got the job done. This base would be rigged with a redstone mechanism that connected to a massive amount of TNT hidden beneath the sand of the desert. And if that wasn't enough, Grian built another contraption in the base with a piston that would retract and cause the sand at the surface to fall down and reveal that this miniature base was actually surrounded by lava. After confirming that both of these redstone mechanisms were fully functional, since he didn't want to take any chances, Grian felt that he and Scar were as ready as they would ever be for battle. The day for the Battle of the Red Desert had finally come, and for everyone present, it was a spectacle of absolute chaos to behold. There was barely any time for anyone to think or act. The desert people had only one shot to win this. As soon as the Red Winter Army arrived at the scene, it was time for the battle to commence. Grian and Scott went off into the battlefield to try and lure Rendog and his army into the area of the desert rigged with TNT, while Scar and Jimmy were waiting on standby inside their base, waiting for Grian to give them the signal to trigger the TNT. As soon as they grabbed the Red Winter Army's attention, Grian and Scott started running back to their desert base, hoping their enemies would follow them back to their base and right into their trap. As soon as the Red Winter Army was in the right range, Grian gave Scar the signal to activate the TNT. The entire desert biome had been utterly obliterated. There was no longer any place within the desert plains for the Sand People to call home. But worst of all, the redstone contraptions Grian made, despite functioning correctly, had failed to eliminate anyone in the Red Winter Army. With no other offensive measures to use against their enemies, the Sand People were forced to resort to old-fashioned sword combat. Sadly, the Red Winter Army began to overtake the Sand People. Jimmy was eliminated from the series, and Grian finally lost his first life, and was released from his obligation to be Scar's teammate. However, even though this could be considered the Sand People's bleakest moment in the series, hope was not yet lost for them. Right when Scar felt he could no longer hold back the Red Winter Army from defeating him, The rest of the Red Desert Army had finally arrived to the scene, ready for battle. As mentioned earlier, Smallish Beans even had his own personal army of wolves to assist in overpowering the Red Winter Army. Eventually, the rest of the Red Desert Army were able to push back the Red Winter Army long enough so the others could band together to try and come up with a new game plan. As for Grian, even though he was no longer obliged to, he decided he couldn't leave Scar behind during the time when he needed his help the most. So Grian met up with Scott, and together they began to scour the server for other players' gear and weapons so he could be ready once again for battle when it occurred. Eventually, Grian and Scott found their way back to Scar, and they began trying to put their heads together for what their next move should be. It was clear that the three of them were no longer in a position to take on the Red Winter Army in their current state, so there was going to have to be a change in plan. Instead, Scott, Grian, and Scar would work together to eliminate the last green lives on the server, those being Impulse, Martin, and Big B. And so, that's what the trio set out to accomplish, and the task was finished successfully. However, the celebration of their victory would have to wait another day, as the Red Winter Army was continuing to wipe out the lives of many players throughout the server. For everyone who was online that day, not just the Sand People, the future was looking grim, and each of them would have to enter into battle with only one thing clear, that there could only be one winner of Third Life. Alright guys, I'm finally through with explaining all the different perspectives of each faction or isolated character throughout this season. Now that I have all of that out of the way, it's time to go over the final segment of this video, that being the series endgame. The server was in shambles. The Red Winter Army was overtaken and finally defeated for good. Many players were hunted down until the last of their lives were taken from them. There were no more factions, war sides, or even rules for the server anymore. All that remained were a couple of sketchy alliances that were bound to break at any moment, and a handful of players who survived the war between the Red Desert and Red Winter armies. Those players were Impulse, Big B, Scar, B-Dubs, and Grian. Let's start this segment by going from where Scar and Grian left off after defeating the Kingdom of Dogworts. Everyone else who was part of the Red Desert Army was either dead or broke off from the team. B-Dubs still retained some resentment against Scar and Grian for bringing him to his red life in the first place. But Scar wouldn't give up on B-Dubs so easily. He had a plan. He and Grian approached B-Dubs' castle base for one last civil discussion. Scar humbly asked B-Dubs to come back onto their side one last time and help them take down Impulse and Big B, who were both on their red life. In exchange, Scar would give B-Dubs a clock. Surprisingly, B-Dubs eagerly accepted Scar's gift and was excited to go on the upcoming murder spree right then and there. Now, something I want to point out to all of you who are watching right now. When B-Dubs said how much he wanted a clock, I'm sure that many of you saw it as just another hilarious moment in the Third Life saga. I too felt the same way the first time I watched this happen. However, I also felt like this was a clever integration of a brilliant callback. If you guys don't know what I'm talking about, let me explain. For those of you who don't watch B-Dubs' channel, a fun fact about him is that he is terrified of the nighttime in Minecraft. Whenever he plays on the Hermitcraft server, he likes to always carry a bed with him in case it ever became nighttime on the server. This was because the Hermitcraft server had a mod that allowed the nighttime to instantly change to morning, as long as one person sleeps. So, B-Dubs ended up getting into the habit of instantly sleeping whenever it started getting dark out when he was online. Unfortunately for him, Third Life was not Hermitcraft, and the sleep mod was no longer available. So for B-Dubs, Carrying around a clock Scar had given him wherever he went was the next best thing in this series. And after all the battles Beat-Ups fought in up to this point, it wouldn't be a surprise if he lost his precious clock at some random point. So this made Beat-Up's acceptance of Scar's deal all the more fitting for his character. Now that Beat-Ups was back on Grian and Scar's side for now, their first goal was to eliminate Impulse. The guy was driving them crazy by his constant alliances, betrayals, and then re-alliances, so their desire to eliminate Impulse was perfectly understandable. So as soon as Impulse caught up with the trio, Scar allowed Beat-Ups to do the honors, and...
Yeah. Impulse, they gave me a clock, so...
Oh.
I have to do this.
What? No!
I have to.
No!
Sorry.
I love Beat-Ups.
Day one crew, what are you doing?
They gave me a clock.
No!
They gave me a clock.
Dude, the power of a...
Just like that, Impulse was no longer an issue. Now that Impulse was gone, the next player that the three friends had to go after was Big B. This was actually going to be a bit of a challenge if it weren't for Beat-Ups. The reason for this was because earlier in the series, Scar gave Big B a no-kill pass that he could activate any time throughout the series. And unfortunately, Big B activated that pass toward the end of the series. And even though Scar could have easily ignored the no-kill pass and kill Big B anyway, since there were technically no rules left on the server, everyone felt like they should at least pretend that wasn't the case. After all, the need for some form of order is just part of human nature. Thankfully, Scar was able to get Beat-Ups to kill Big B instead, and he was able to get it over with pretty easily, compared to what had to happen next. The time had come for the last alliances to turn on each other. There was just one problem. The idea of turning on your own alliances is easier said than done. So this was a matter that certainly made things complicated between the three friends. Let me clarify just one quick fact about these three remaining players. Beat-Ups and Scar were both on their red life, and Grian was still on his second life. Now, after a moment of quiet bickering, Scar came up with a solution. After Big B was defeated, Scar went through his loot and picked up his no-kill pass. He asked Grian and Beat-Ups to stand apart from each other at a decent length, while Scar stood right at the center between the two of them, and he placed the no-kill pass on the ground, and said that the first person to get the pass into their inventory would be the person Scar wouldn't kill first. After a few seconds of frantic dialogue between the two of them, Beat-Ups was the one to get the no-kill pass first. So Scar ended up sparing Beat-Ups' life and taking away Grian's life. After that was over, Scar and Beat-Ups took a walk around the map, trying to debate a good time to turn on each other. As for Grian, he was infuriated at Scar's betrayal, especially after everything he had done to keep Scar alive up to this point. Fortunately, Grian knew that something like this was going to happen eventually, so he prepared an emergency chest full of leftover diamond gear so he could get back up on his feet and prepare to fight Scar and Beat-Ups. After a few minutes of searching the map, Grian found Beat-Ups and Scar walking together amongst the forest trees atop a hill. At the sight of this, Grian grew ever more infuriated. Did Scar no longer consider Grian as his friend? Was he going to befriend Beat-Ups instead? There was only one way to find out. Without a spark of hesitation, Grian leaped straight into action, knocking both Beat-Ups and Scar off the hill and into a stream of water below. First, Grian directed his anger toward Beat-Ups, and unbeknownst to him, Scar had joined his side, and together, they finally eliminated Beat-Ups from the series. With Beat-Ups finally gone, Grian turned his anger towards Scar. As Grian chipped away at Scar's health, he noticed something off. Scar wasn't even defending himself. In fact, in that moment, Scar said he wanted Grian to kill him and take the title as the winner of Third Life. He felt like Grian had earned it after everything he had done to keep him alive and bring him to this point in the series. So he lowered his weapon and bowed his head for Grian to attack him. Grian, however, couldn't bring himself to kill Scar after everything he just heard. He was full of emotions of relief and regret, knowing that he was still Scar's greatest friend, and that he still held him in such high regard, even after all the times he spent with Scar, when he always accused him of being nothing more than a manipulative outlaw. There was no way he could kill him now without any remorse for his best friend. As for Scar, he couldn't bring himself to kill Grian after all he had done to earn this victory. After all, every terrifying action taken by the Sand People that caused people to fear Scar even more, it was all thanks to Grian. Grian was the one responsible for getting Scar to his second life. Grian was the one who built the Sand Fortress to hold all their valuable loot. Grian was the one who built the Creeper Farm that helped the Sand People have a surplus of gunpowder to make TNT. Grian was the one who strongly encouraged Scar to begin the process of eliminating the other players as soon as he got to his red life. It was Grian who set up all the clever traps that caused many players to lose their lives. But most of all, Grian was the one who never left Scar's side, even when he was no longer obligated to do so. No matter how many superficial friendships Scar forged with the other factions, Grian was always Scar's truest and most loyal friend through it all. Since it was clear that neither Grian or Scar were able to bring themselves to kill each other, they thought about potentially concluding the series with a double victory. However, many players who were observing Grian and Scar's last moments together strongly insisted they follow through with the one rule regarding the series finale, that there could only be one winner. Grian and Scar finally decided to accept the fact that the only way to end the series, in a way that was satisfactory for the other Third Lifers, was for the two of them to fight each other. So before commencing the duel, Scar placed a boat in a nearby pond, and he and Grian climbed in as a way to take a moment and reflect on all the vivid memories, both good and bad, that brought them to this moment.
Here's steakhouse.
This is the least safest house I've ever seen.
This is option.
This is not the safest.
Fine, I'm just gonna burn it down.
Nice God.
You know what? I'm all for science and discovery. I feel like this is science and discovery.
Science.
We are science bros. So
And so, they decided to take the duel back to their now-destroyed desert base, right next to Scar's pet llama's grave. No weapons, no armor, just straight-up old-fashioned fist combat. And just before the battle commenced, Grian made his final promise to Scar, that no matter how this duel ended, he and Scar would take up the title of Third Life Victor together. And with one final countdown, the duel commenced. As the two friends battled each other, all they could say to each other was how sorry they were that their friendship had to end this way. And then, with one final blow to his opponent, the one to survive the duel and claim the title of victory was Grian. There Grian stood, all alone in the entire server, overflowing with regret after having just murdered his best friend of the entire series. And with that, he jumped off a nearby cliff, thereby ending his last life, along with his series' perspective, wishing things could have been resolved differently. And that is the conclusion for the story of Grian, of the Sand People, and of the entire Third Life saga. Well, that was a lot of ground to cover, but anyway, in conclusion, I think the Third Life series was a phenomenal experience, and it was fun to explore the different perspectives of everyone involved. If all of you watching enjoyed this series review, make sure to leave a like on this video, and if this channel gets enough support, maybe I will do a review of the recently established Last Life series next. And remember guys, whatever negative criticism I might have brought up regarding this series was not meant to spread hate to any of the content creators involved. That criticism was just my personal opinion, and I still appreciate every bit of effort from everyone involved in the Third Life series. All the clips that were featured in this video came from their channels, and I will be sure to link them all down in the description below, so be sure to check them all out. And also, let me know in the comments who you thought had the best storyline in this series. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye guys!